Well, the topic of my presentation is on anarchist political economy and power elite theory, subtitled How States, Ruling Classes, and Empires Intersect. Who are our rulers? Who are those that are ruling over us? Let's find out. First of all, there's the question of what is political economy. As Adam said in the introduction, I'm a sociologist and historian by training, and political economy is a big part of the social sciences. It's an interdisciplinary branch of the social sciences that focuses on the interrelationship between political systems and economic systems, the relationship between material production and political power. Right? The core elements of political economy are the role of the state, market structures, competition, the distribution of wealth and income, globalization, international relations, and ideologies and political systems. We could add to that a lot of other things. There's culture, of course, is extremely important. As far as types of political economy, the main types we're familiar with are capitalism, socialism, and communism. Of course, there's always been a bit of a disagreement on how these things should be properly defined. I tend to go with the basic dictionary definitions since that's what most people are familiar with. Capitalism is a system based on the profit motive, market exchange. Socialism or social democracy is a sort of a mixture of public and private economy with the social safety net, and then communism is a command economy. And then we have anarchism. Anarchism is the idea, of course, that the state is inherently illegitimate. It's skeptical of authority and hierarchy. There's different types of anarchism, as we know. One example of anarchy in the real world is the Zamir region. The sociologist James Scott wrote about this. It's a vast region in Southeast Asia that is stateless. I think something like 11 million people live there still today. All right, and then we have anarchist political economy, which is presented as an alternative to these state-dominated systems that I just described. And there's the question of, well, what is the features of an anarchist political economy? There's a good number of principles. There's anti-authoritarianism, anti-capitalism, anti-statism, anti-imperialism, anti-militarism, anti-misogyny, anti-racial repression, autonomy, bottom-up organizing, civil liberties, cultural freedom, decentralization, direct action, federalism, free association, individual sovereignty, localism, mutual aid, non-coercion, non-hierarchy, self-management, social ecology, and voluntary cooperation. We could add more, but that's a good introduction. One thing that I'm often asked by non-anarchists is they will say, well, do anarchists have any real ideas? And I always respond, yeah, there's a whole lot of them, just look it up. Right? So anarchists seek to develop alternative models of political economy that eliminate the dependency on the state or corporations, central banks, or the impersonal forces of the market. And there are a lot of different models of economic organizations that have been proposed by anarchists. Again, I've got a long list: cooperatives, collectives, communes, clubs, village communities, intentional communities, guilds, mutual aid societies, mutual banks, alternative currencies, land trusts, worker councils, individual and family enterprises. I won't read over everything here, but you can see that there's quite a bit of ideas that anarchists have about what alternative models of political economy might look like without the state or without dependence on the mass corporations or the big financial institutions. Right? And a common term for this is the solidarity economy. That is an economy that's based not on simply the heavy hand of the state and not just an economy based on the impersonal market exchange forces, but on solidarity, mutual aid, and voluntary cooperation. And that leads us to the question of, well, what is the state? A pretty good definition of the state, I think, involves these like 6 or 7 principles here. What does the state do?
The core anarchist critique of the state is that the state is basically just a form of organized crime. And think of the mafia with a flag. That's pretty much what the state is. Right? Because like organized crime, what does the state seek to do? Well, it tries to control territory, monopolize resources, exploit subjects, protect and artificially a privileged elite, that is an elite that's not there due to merit or respect or anything that might be a more serious, legitimate way to develop an elite, but simply an elite that rules through connivance or coercion. Right? The state seeks to expand its own realm of power and influence. It uses violence to eliminate competitors, and it also maintains a self-legitimating ideological superstructure. And I think that point is particularly important because there's this idea of, well, why do so many people follow and accept the commands of the state when that's what the state is? It's just the mafia with the flag. There was an interesting essay about this written back in the Renaissance era by Taki, who said, it's called Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, and this idea is, well, people follow the state because they've been inculcated with this ideological superstructure. That's a Marxist term, but it has a relevance to what we're discussing here as well, because people are acculturated to this, and that's the function of institutions. Education, for example. I grew up in the United States and in the American school system when I was a child. Whether you were in a private school or a public school or a parochial school, first thing you did every morning was you put your hand on your chest and pledged allegiance to the American flag. So we're all inculcated with this kind of deification of the state from childhood on. All right, this is a bit blurry, but there are a number of historical theories on the origins of the state. In the social sciences, these are the dominant theories on where the state came from. The one that is most compatible with anarchist political theory, and the one that I subscribe to, is force theory. And that's a pretty simple idea. The idea is that, well, where did the state come from? It evolved through conquest and plunder. The first states began when people started going out and killing other people and taking other people's things, and nothing much has changed since then. But there are other theories on the origin of the state. One is the divine right of kings theory. That comes in many forms, and that is there's some sort of religious justification for the state. That's been going on since at least ancient Egypt, when they worshiped the pharaohs as the sun god. There's a Christian version of that goes back to medieval times. There's an Islamic version of it. The problem I always saw with this from the time I first heard of it, is that if the kings are divine or appointed by God, that doesn't really portray God in a very good light. But, then there's evolutionary theory. Of all of the non-anarchist theories on the origins of the state, I think this is the one you could probably make the most solid intellectual argument for. But the idea is that the state evolved through the process of extended families and then clans and tribes and these kinds of organizations morphing into state systems. Now, I would argue the problem there is that you still have to apply the insights of force theory, because it's possible to have large tribes and clans and extended families that don't actually engage in conquest and plunder and subjugation. And then, of course, there's the social contract theory. That's what most modern states that we're familiar with are based on. In a standard mainstream political science class anywhere in the West today, you'd probably be taught that the social contract is the basis of the state's legitimacy. There's this mythical contract. Did any of you ever sign a contract to do what the state says? It's like, I didn't, but I wouldn't if I was offered the opportunity. But that is the social contract theory really is the basis of the ideological superstructure of most modern states today, certainly the liberal states. All right, then there's the question of, well, what is a ruling class? The ruling class exists to control resources, maintain political dominance, maintain a system of economic privilege, convey social prestige upon itself. Ruling classes also are interconnected networks that have common interests along these lines. and then they exist to reproduce this privilege over time. Right? That's just a pyramid from, this is actually from a very old issue of the Industrial Worker from probably the early 20th century. The Industrial Workers of the World was an American anarcho-syndicalist labor union. This is an old image from one of their publications illustrating how the pyramid of the capitalist system actually works. You can see you've got all of the common people on the bottom holding up the system while you have the parasites on the top leeching off of everyone else. And that brings us to elite theory. Elite theory argues that power structures are multipartite, meaning there's multiple centers of power that are interconnected with each other. And they issue interlocking directorates, that is systems of control. They exist to control resources. There's a dominance of decision-making processes. Elites reproduce themselves over time. And also they dominate the cultural institutions. And it's through the cultural institutions that the elites disseminate their self-legitimating ideological superstructure. They inculcate everyone with this kind of belief system that the rule by particular ruling classes is somehow legitimate and moral and proper in a way that would be dubious if you looked at it without those kinds of rose-colored glasses. All right. Power elite theory is a sociological theory that explores how power is distributed among different types of elites in different societies. As the column on the left says, there's different types of elites: political, financial, religious, corporate, media, academic, cultural, military. There's some examples of elites on the other side. They may be drawn from different areas or different layers of society, but collectively they interact within respective societies to form the elite. And then there's the question of what is an empire? Well, an empire is simply a ruling class that's engaged in territorial expansion. Empires tend to have, or do have, centralized authority. They practice imperialism, which is just another way of saying looting and plundering. They are typically rather diverse, heterogeneous. Empires by nature tend to be culturally cosmopolitan. To really have a successful empire, your empire has to be culturally diverse for obvious reasons, because the larger the territorial domain that's under your control, the more diverse the population groups are going to be. Interestingly, cultures that tend towards a high level of xenophobia typically do not make for very good imperialists. If you look at which countries or societies historically have been the most successful imperialists, they tended to be seafaring people, not landlocked people. And they also tended to be cultures that were fairly cosmopolitan. Right? And then, of course, you have the state cult that conveys an aura of imperial legitimacy. And then empires also go through stages of imperial decline and collapse. It's interesting how with every empire that emerges, you always have the overlords who say that, well, it won't happen to their empire. They'll say, well, all these empires in the past, they existed forever, or, well, they came and went, but ours is going to exist forever. I'm an American, and I know plenty of Americans who say the American empire is going to exist forever because we're just that special, and I always say, no, we're not. It's going to happen to us, too. It's already started. All right, this is just a graph that shows how empires rise and decline. They'll go through phases of success and prosperity, and then they start to enter the stage of decadence, and then they start to experience decline. Again, being an American, I see this every day. It's happening now. And then there's this question of who are the power elite. Again, as I said, elite theory is a theory that the state seeks to describe and explain power relationships in society. Right? There's always this small coterie of elites that dominate institutions and organizations that control the wider society and shape the course of the society. And you have hegemonic social groups that
form the power elite, and they can be drawn from any number of sources. They can be of the royalty or monarchy, the nobility, the military, social classes, dominant geographical regions, dominant ethnic, racial, and linguistic groups, dominant religions, family, usually older people, usually male. Right? How does the power elite exercise control? Through the directorship of corporations, influence over policy networks. Again, it's all about control over institutions that shape the course of society. Right? Way back in 150 BC, Polybius referred to what we would today call elite theory as simply autocracy. He was well known for talking about the sources of power in societies. There could be one man, it can be a few men, it can be many, and the need for a balance of power. That's Polybius, right? And as Polybius pointed out, monarchies often deteriorate into tyranny. Democracies become mob ruled, and ruled by elites become an oligarchy. Organizations and institutions generally have a tendency towards oligarchy. And that's particularly true of coercive organizations like the state. The more an organization has the ability to engage in coercive force, the more oligarchical it tends to be. Right? There was a lot of important insights about this that were drawn from the Italian school of elitism, thinkers like Porto, Mosca, Michaels. In my view, this is essential reading if you really want to understand the social sciences. Interestingly, it's not really taught in the academy anymore. In academia, there's a tendency to de-emphasize these thinkers, I think, for obvious reasons. Right? Those are the three men that I just mentioned, Pareto, Mosca, and Michaels. All right. The Italian school produced a lot of interesting insights. They talked about the ways in which power lies in different types of institutions, the psychological factors that are involved, the variations in intelligence and skills, the level of vested interest that's involved, the fact that the masses often have trouble governing themselves because when you get a mass of people, there's a question of competence and organization and a lot of other factors. So inefficiency comes into play. And as a result, it's very easy for elites to manipulate the masses. Right. Pareto emphasized the psychological and intellectual superiority of elites. I tend to be somewhat skeptical of that claim. I tend to think that elites are often people who are just simply better scammers. That it's not that they're necessarily superior in any more serious way. All right. Mosca talked quite a bit about the circulation of elites, how elites rise and fall, and the different types of elites. Michaels was the one who developed the iron law of oligarchy. As I said, institutions of any size tend to veer towards oligarchy, ruled by the few over the many. That tends to be true of organizations of any type, but coercive organizations in particular. Right? Right? This was a sociologist, Elmer Eric Schneider. He criticized the pluralist theory of modern liberal democracy. Most societies that we're familiar with are liberal democracies. And one of the theories behind liberal democracy is pluralism, that you have the people can rule as a collective democratically, and you have a pluralistic society where everybody gets equal representation and an equal chance. And he pointed out, he said the problem with that is that it sings with a strong upper class accent, meaning that liberal democracy is really just a mask for class rule. He talked about the dominance of financial and economic elites. This fellow here is C. Wright Mills. He was a sociologist at Columbia University in the 1950s. He was famous for riding a motorcycle around campus. I actually had a professor in college who studied under him. Right? And he believed that political power and economic power and military power intersect in advanced societies. And that creates the kind of oligarchies that we see in so-called liberal democracy. All right, this is another interesting book. This was a classic work by Floyd Hunter, and he was interested in how power and community influence each other. Typically what happens is you will have elites within local communities. You'll have local elites that are then cultivated by the higher level elites as functionaries. And that's a way in which the state is able to maintain the dominance over communities. They do it through co-opting local leadership. Now, that's one of the hallmarks of imperialism. In imperialist structures, what do you actually see? You see systems where usually there's some local ruler who's essentially a puppet of the external colonizers. And that works on an internal basis in societies as well as on an external basis. William Domhoff was another sociologist. He was a student of C. Wright Mills. He wrote about this more extensively. That's William Domhoff. He had a classic work called Who Rules America? And his analysis would apply to most liberal democracies. He used the United States as his case study, but it's a fairly similar situation everywhere. Arguing that these large income producing properties like banks and corporations are what dominate the system of power politically and economically. Right. This is another interesting work. This is a classic work in sociology from the 1940s by James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution. And Burnham talked about how in modern societies we've started to see the emergence of these managerial bureaucracies that control everything, and it's something that cuts across institutional boundaries. If all of us have had the experience of dealing with, first of all, government, with corporations, with financial institutions, with educational institutions. If you've ever been in the military, you certainly know how this works. You have these managerial bureaucracies that are really the de facto functionaries of the wider ruling class that govern modern societies. Burnham also argued that this was something that cut across ideological boundaries as well. Like, it didn't really matter what kind of government a country had or what its official ideology was. He was writing in the 1940s, and he looked at the United States and England, and he looked at fascist Italy and National Socialist Germany and Soviet Russia, and said that this managerial bureaucracy was a unique feature of modernity, and it was developing in all modern societies and in a way that had a life of its own, irrespective of these other ideological and institutional and cultural forces. That's James Burnham. All right, that was his book. All right, this is important here. We've seen the emergence in recent times of what we call the new class. This emerged out of the managerial revolution. Irving Kristol was one of the founders of the neocon movement, and probably the only thing he ever said that I would agree with was the fact that we do have this new class that's emerged out of this managerial revolution that tends to be highly influential in modern societies. Barbara Ehrenreich was a leftist. She passed away a few years ago. She was a well-known leftist writer in America. She called this the professional managerial class. I would add to that that there was an interesting study done by Thomas Piketty, an economist, a couple of years ago, where he was talking about class voting patterns in elections in Western democracies. And he argued that the real base of the left is no longer the working class, but instead it's this professional managerial class. He calls it the Brahmin left, that is the intellectuals and professionals. That's really the foundation of what passes itself off as the left in modern societies. Right. This is a well-known sociological work, Bowling Alone. What this book is about is atomization. That's the author, Robert Putnam. Right. Bowling Alone was about the decline of social trust. Political theorists, going back to at least Aristotle, have always argued that to have a functional society, a productive society, or a healthy society, you have to have a high level of social trust. But one of the features of all of these things that I'm describing now is that they erode social trust, particularly when you have huge disparities of wealth. And as a result, you have societies that tend to be fragmented, where you have warring groups pitted against one another. In American political science, we call them interest groups. I tend to just call them political tribes. And you also have atomized individualism, where individuals become rootless. I think that my own country, the United States, is probably the most advanced in this direction. We're probably the most rootless people that I've ever encountered. I also think that explains why some of the bizarre criminal behavior we see in the United States as commonplace, things like serial killers, mass shooters, some of that kind of stuff seems more frequent in the United States than in many other places. And I think a reason for that is because Americans are so rootless and atomized that it produces a lot of mentally unbalanced people. This was another interesting work by Thomas Dye, describing power elites from a more analytical perspective. Right? This is about the institutional mechanisms through which power elites operate, nonprofit foundations, think tanks. Every country, every so-called liberal democracy certainly has variations of these kinds of institutions. Right. Also, control over energy resources is critically important. George Gonzalez worked on that a bit. That's George Gonzalez. Right. And that's been particularly true in the modern age when everything is so energy dependent. I would argue a lot of the United States aggression in the Middle East during that time period was clearly rooted in this. That's certainly not the other factor. There's another major factor, and we all know what that is, but this is one of them. Okay. Dahrendorf was a German sociologist that also talked about political parties and the way that they function as agencies for elites. They're essentially an administrative set of administrative units for elites. This was another interesting work that talked about the role of political power and economic inequality. These are the authors. This was an interesting study that they did. They did a statistical analysis of over 1,700 policy issues representing a wide range of institutions, and they found that the rich got what they wanted most of the time, the middle class the rest of the time, and the poor none of the time. Thomas Ferguson, he's talked about the relationship between electoral politics and capitalism, and how essentially political coalitions are coalitions of investors. They're trying to buy a piece of the system. It's Thomas Ferguson. All right. Now there's also this question of who are the individuals that make up the power elite that we're talking about. There's some obvious names right here. There's the Rothschild dynasty, the Rockefellers, the Morgans. These are among the most well-known. You have the traditional royal dynasties, many of which are still around, many of which still exercise a great deal of influence, certainly behind the scenes. I've noticed that these people often try to be somewhat invisible. Not all of them, obviously, but they're still there. And just a list of some of the examples. Along with the aristocratic dynasties. You've got powerful clerics in some countries. In the Western world today, we tend to be a little less religious than perhaps we once were, but that's not true everywhere. In a lot of places, the clerisy still holds a great deal of power. Of course, there's our friends, the bankers, right? And these are some of the most powerful banking entities out there today. There's these old bourgeois dynasties that exist from country to country. A lot of these have their roots going back to the Industrial Revolution. Quite a few of them are Americans, obviously. And then you have this nouveau riche class, which I think is interesting because a lot of the conspicuously wealthy today, the people that we think of as the super rich, if you ask someone off the street, well, who's an example of a rich person? It's some of these names. It's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Trump, obviously, some others. But these people are really more of, I guess you could say they're kind of like the upper level of the upper middle class. They don't really come from the traditional ruling class. They're sort of the next step down. they're engaged in what an economist named Thorsten Blaebling called conspicuous consumption. That is, these are people that flaunt their wealth publicly. They like to get their name in the paper and on television. You also have the large asset management firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, plenty of others. I was doing some research recently on ownership of the media in the United States, and what I found is that BlackRock and Vanguard probably own a larger share of the U.S. media than any other organizations. They also own a larger share of the U.S. armaments industry than any other entities. Right? Some others. Of course, the media conglomerates. A theory that I have is that the media really plays in many ways the same role as the church in traditional societies, because in traditional societies, the religious institutions tend to be the ones that disseminate the values and social norms of the wider culture. In societies where religious influence is not as pervasive, that tends to be replaced by other things. And I think in today's world, the media and also the educational system, the universities, and then there's the normal schooling system, are sort of the new church. You know, we could call this the electronic church, because these are the institutions that shape the cultural norms of the society. Of course, you've got the arms manufacturers, what were once called the merchants of death. You have the most powerful political parties, obviously. And you've got the most powerful countries to which the others are largely subordinate. And then you've got the transnational organization through which different ruling classes, different national ruling classes collectively coordinate their common interests across international boundaries. The UN, the World Bank, IMF, WHO. We heard quite a bit about that one during the pandemic. Okay. And then you have the question of international conflict. And that's interesting to look at from the point of view of power elite theory. The point of view on international conflict that I hold to is within the Machiavellian realist tradition. It's the idea, well, classical realists believe that conflict follows from human nature. You know, the reason we have conflict in the world is because, well, human beings are just that. You know, human beings are disagreeable creatures. There's a branch called neo-realism that attributes conflict to the dynamics of they call it anarchic state system, meaning there's no overarching authority, you just have competition between states. And then I tend to lean towards the neoclassical view, which synthesizes the two. You know, that it's basically, yes, human beings have a nature that can be combative, but then when states enter the picture, what you really have is just gang warfare, and that's what we see on an international level. You know, it's basically a rivalry between mafias. Right? And these are the core principles of interstate relations, according to realist theory: state centrism, anarchy in the pejorative sense, rationality, and power dynamics. Right? But you also have conflict within ruling classes. You have conflict between national ruling classes and international branches of ruling classes, but within particular societies you have intra-state or intra-ruling class conflict as well. One example that I posted here is there was a thesis written by Carl Oglesby. He was a leader of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 60s. And he argued that much of American politics is shaped by what he calls the Yankees. These are the old money oligarchs, the Rockefellers, the Ivy League bankers, and so forth, who are largely based in the Atlantic region of the United States, versus the cowboys, who are the more newly rich Westerners. They're based in the defense industry, the oil, minerals, and things like that. If you look at American elections and the competition between Democrats and Republicans, you can see that. You can see that nowadays the Yankees tend to be the ones behind the Democratic Party pulling its strings. The Cowboys are behind the Republican Party. And you have a comparable dynamic in many other countries. Right? That's the original book. Right? Then, of course, you have layers and divisions within the ruling class. Right? You have all these different sectors of the ruling class, and all these different functions. And the ruling class, like everything else, is stratified and divided into sectors. At the bottom here, you can see how all of these different kinds of so-called advocacy groups and social justice movements, these are actually fronts for ruling class interest in various instances. A lot of them are heavily funded by various ruling class think tanks and NGOs. We've already talked a little bit about what is an empire, but again, it's this regional construct based on territorial hegemony that engages in territorial expansion, maintains centralized authority, diverse populations, and engages in economic exploitation and in a way that fuels economic integration. We try to integrate the outlying areas into the imperial core, but in a very exploitative, domineering sense. And of course, to have a successful empire, you need military strength. And again, there's always some cultural or ideological justification for this. You know, like I said earlier, all ruling classes have some kind of ideological superstructure they maintain that ostensibly justifies their legitimacy. No matter how dubious it may be, once you really critique it and see that there's nothing underneath the surface. Yeah. Some of the greatest empires from history: the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Ottoman Empire, of course today's global American Empire, which is probably a little less stylish than some of the earlier ones. Right? So the American Empire is obviously the world's largest empire today, rooted in this post-World War II order. Now, it's interesting because when I talk to Americans about this, a lot of Americans are aware of the economic expansion that happened in the United States itself after World War II, and for the first time in history we had a working class that could live like the upper middle class in the United States. But very few Americans understand why that was. They understand that, they don't understand that the reason for it was that in the late 1940s, the United States controlled half the world economy. And how did they get that? Well, they killed off all of their competitors. I mean, it was no different than when a mafia family dominates crime syndicates in a particular city by simply massacring all the other crime families. That's how the United States got to be the dominant world power. Obviously, military supremacy, economic control. The United States exercises economic control over the world through the IMF and these other kinds of institutions, or certainly much of the world. And then there's the cultural and ideological influence. We have these pieties that are widely promoted, democracy, human rights, liberal economics. All of these things are just a smokescreen for imperialism. One of the impacts of empires is that they tend to fuel fairly large-scale demographic change. And the American empires probably had a greater effect along those lines than any pre-existing empire. We see the mass migration that happens in contemporary societies. When we see this thing called multiculturalism that's promoted as sort of an end unto itself. There's a wider body of geopolitical and economic forces behind that, obviously. Right? And then, of course, the standard criticisms of the global American empire are its imperialistic nature, the amount of economic exploitation, cultural homogenization, and forced subjugation. Right? So the U.S. exercises control over other states, and then some of those may exercise control over states underneath them. A hierarchical pyramid that maintains economic exploitation through these international organizations, produces this kind of cultural homogenization with the level of subjugation and control that's involved. All right, but we also see what I think is interesting today is the emerging multipolarity. In many ways, the world seems to be going back to a world order fairly similar to what we saw in the 19th century. We could argue that a multipolar world, let's skip a slide here, I think I did. Oh no. Right. We could argue that the world is now moving towards a greater level of multipolarity with multiple centers of competing imperial power. With the digital revolution, the tech revolution fueling that, it's having an effect similar to the industrial revolution. With this professional managerial class I was speaking of earlier, you could say that they are the new bourgeoisie. And then this PC, woke, social justice warrior stuff, whatever you want to call it, that's the new self-legitimating ideological superstructure. I mean, that's the modern version of divine right of kings, or the divinity of the emperor, or something like that. Right? With this thing called human rights as the new version of the white man's burden. Right? Neoliberalism is the new liberal imperialism. Of course, it's being challenged by these rival imperialisms or counter-imperialisms. One ongoing debate that I have with my Marxist-Leninist friends is that they will try to claim that the BRICS powers and their allies are anti-imperialist, and I will say no, I would consider them counter-imperialist. They may be seeking to counter the hegemony of the dominant imperial power, but they simply want imperialisms of their own. That's what the world looked like in 1900. It was divided into about a dozen or so empires with their own spheres of influence. And we seem to be moving in a similar direction nowadays. In the late Mao period in China, they developed a theory called the three worlds theory, which is not really the same thing as the Western concept of the first world or third world. But at the time, they argued that the first world were the superpowers, and then their immediate allies were the second world, and then the outlying countries were the third world. And of course, they considered China to be the natural leader of the third world. But I think we could revise this theory somewhat and talk about how the new first world are these emerging major multipolar powers. Obviously, we have the USA still, and in some ways the USA and Israel has essentially become the same. And then there's Russia and China. And then we've got the countries that are immediately allied with these emerging multipolar powers. And then you've got these other spheres of influence and other rising powers in different regions. Yeah. Then there's this question of conspiracy theory. I put this in here because I'm frequently asked about this. I'm frequently asked about, what do you think about conspiracy theories? There's this idea nowadays that conspiracy theories are something negative that ought to be avoided, but it's not quite that simple. We know that conspiracies really do happen. For example, if two people say, we're going to murder this other person, well, that's a conspiracy to commit murder. At least that's what it's called in American law. So conspiracies do happen. So the question is it's a question of not denying that there's a such thing as conspiracies. You just want to approach the analysis of conspiracies in an intelligent manner, right? So Karl Popper was the one who popularized the idea of conspiracy theories. His goal was to defend liberal societies against their critics, but in the process, he sought to undermine legitimate criticism. Right? And this stigmatization of conspiracy theory as something negative started back in the 1960s after the assassination of President Kennedy. A lot of people didn't buy the Warren Commission's findings that the alleged assassin did not have any accomplices. So the CIA tried to counter that. They tried to started attacking this concept of conspiracy theories. Right? That's just a somewhat amusing graphic of how the world works. You've got the top-hatted capitalists at the top laughing while the people fight over trivialities and irrelevancies. These are, just for the sake of amusements, these are some of the models of conspiracy theory that are out there, some of the more exotic ones. The Illuminati, the one that some of these theories will vary widely in terms of where they rank different groups or individuals or whatever on the pyramid, but a lot of them overlap with each other, but they've all got their focus and emphasis, you know. Is it the Bilderbergers, you know, is it this Council of 13, you know, the Illuminati royal bloodlines. The problem that I have with a lot of these ideas is that it's not that they are conspiratorial, it's just that they overstate their case. You know, they make it more complicated than it really needs to be. To really understand any real conspiracies that go on, all you really have to do is look at who is the beneficiary. You know, if you want to understand what a situation, why a situation is the way it is, who is the beneficiary of that situation? Who would have had the ability to shape a particular situation and make it what it is? And some of these get pretty exotic, you know, but they're not entirely wrong either. You know, I tend to say that a conspiracy theorist in this kind of crude sense is really just a low information power elite theorist. Right? So conspiracy theory is legitimate as a sociological subfield. Right? It's simply about explaining how different interests collude in order to advance themselves at the expense or subjugation of others. Right? And there are certainly conspiracies that we know do happen that are well known. Conspiracies are put in place as a form of social engineering. I mean, we know, for example, about things like the intelligence services engaging in experiments with drugs as mind control devices. Whether those experiments turned out the way they wanted them to or not is a different question, but they do happen. Social engineering. So conspiracy theory is just about how elites use their power to shape public perceptions and control opposition. You know, Noam Chomsky had this idea called manufacture of consent. You know, that is, power elites work to establish a consensus in the wider society that upholds their own interests. And elites manipulate social structures towards this purpose. So conspiracy theory is a legitimate model of sociological research. When doing this kind of analysis, I found it very helpful to do cross-ideological analysis. That is, I think one problem that a lot of sociological theory has is that it tends to be driven by ideologues that never really look at what other political tribes or other types of political thinkers are saying. And if you look at different analytical frameworks from across the political and cultural spectrum, what you can often find is that if you blend a lot of the insights that are derived from this work, that you get a pretty interesting picture of how things actually work in the real world. One of my favorite analysts of this type is Anthony Sutton. He discussed the interlocking relationship between capitalism, communism, and fascism, and how Wall Street was actually the nexus of all of them, that all of these movements and systems were funded in part by Wall Street. This is an old book from the early 70s called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. I think that it's a book that overstates its case, but it's also a very good overview on a very basic level of how international power elites work, particularly the international financial institutions. Gary North was a Calvinist, so he's writing from a Christian perspective. He had a very similar work, though, to that of Anthony Sutton, that went into some of the same issues. Kerry Bolton, if you've ever read a book called Revolution from Above by Kerry Bolton, that's a very good book that gets into this. There's a commentator on YouTube, a Muslim by the name of Shahid Bolson, that also deals with these issues. I'd highly recommend his channel. It's called The Middle Nation. This is a book by an American Marxist, Caleb Maupin, who talks about how the intelligence services have worked to cultivate all of this woke stuff that we see today as a type of ideological superstructure and also as a type of controlled opposition. Murray Rothbard. He was a libertarian that had an interesting essay on the conspiracy theory of history. I'd recommend that as well. All right, so that's the bulk of my presentation.